Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a gentle, meandering stroll through the peculiar pathways of medieval fashion, specifically focusing on a trend so utterly bizarre, so wonderfully impractical, that a king felt compelled to issue a royal decree against it. Imagine, if you will, the bustling, muddy streets of 14th century Paris. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, damp earth, and perhaps a hint of unwashed humanity. You're jostling past merchants hawking their wares, apprentices running errands, and noblemen on horseback, their silken capes fluttering in the breeze. Now, look down at your feet. What do you see? If you were a fashionable, well-to-do gentleman of the era, you'd likely be sporting something truly extraordinary. Shoes so long, so ridiculously elongated at the toe, that they curled up like the horns of some mythical beast. We're talking about the poulaine or craco, a footwear phenomenon that swept across Europe and then, quite literally, tripped up the monarchy. You probably won't survive this fashion trend without a broken toe, a perpetual scowl from tripping, or perhaps a royal summons for being too stylish. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, perhaps share your location and what time it is for you. Are you winding down in London, just catching the evening chill? Or is it the bright afternoon in Sydney, and you're prepping for a long night of work? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins in an age where life was, shall we say, a little less cushioned than our own. Forget your ergonomic sneakers and plush slippers. In the late Middle Ages, every step was an adventure, often involving uneven cobblestones, open sewers, and the occasional wandering farm animal. And yet, amidst this delightful chaos, a curious obsession began to take hold, primarily among the upper echelons of society. It was an obsession with length, specifically the length of one's shoes. These shoes, known as poulaines, a name believed to derive from Poland, though historians still argue whether their origin truly lies there, or if the name simply stuck due to Polish fashion forwardness, were not just shoes. They were statements. They were declarations of wealth, status, and a delightful disregard for common sense. Imagine trying to walk, let alone run, with an extra foot or more of empty, pointed leather extending beyond your toes. Picture attempting to navigate stairs, or board a carriage, or even just sit down without impaling your neighbor or yourself. It sounds utterly preposterous, doesn't it? And yet, the trend escalated. The longer your poulaine, the more important you were perceived to be. It was like a medieval game of who has the biggest shoe. And just like any good fashion trend, it wasn't enough to simply have them. You had to have the longest ones. These weren't flimsy slippers, mind you. These were often meticulously crafted, sometimes reinforced with whalebone or moss to maintain their gravity-defying shape. A true status symbol, they were often made from luxurious leathers, velvet, or even silk, sometimes embroidered with intricate patterns or adorned with precious jewels. Imagine the cobbler, hunched over his bench, painstakingly shaping a toe that was twice the length of the wearer's actual foot. He'd probably be muttering under his breath about the absurdity of it all, but then he'd remember the fat coin purse waiting for him and get back to work. The earliest appearances of these elongated shoes can be traced back to the 12th century, but it wasn't until the 14th century that they truly ballooned, both in popularity and in actual size. By the time our story truly gets going, in the late 1300s, some poulaines had reached truly absurd lengths, reportedly up to 2.5 feet beyond the wearer's actual foot. Yes, you heard that correctly. 2.5 feet. That's longer than some small children. One might wonder how anyone managed to dance, or even just stand still, without performing an involuntary front flip. It's safe to say that the concept of comfort was a rather fluid one in medieval times. The fashion was not confined to men, though it was predominantly a male affectation. Women, too, embraced longer, pointed shoes, albeit usually with a slightly more restrained length. But for the gentlemen of means, it was a competition. a visual arms race of ankle-to-toe extravagance. You could tell a man's position in society simply by glancing at his feet. A common laborer would have practical, sturdy boots, perhaps with a slightly rounded toe for comfort and durability. But a nobleman, a knight, or a wealthy merchant, their feet would be encased in magnificent, impractical, and profoundly long poulaines. They probably had to walk sideways through doorways like crabs or risk getting perpetually stuck. It makes you wonder how they ever managed a quick getaway from, say, a charging boor or an angry tax collector. Perhaps the extra length acted as a sort of built-in tripwire for pursuers. The sheer impracticality was part of the allure, of course. Only someone of leisure, someone who didn't have to engage in manual labor or, heaven forbid, run for their life, could afford to wear such an impediment. It was a clear signal. I am so wealthy I can afford to walk around in shoes that actively make my life harder, just because I can. It was the medieval equivalent of driving a supercar through rush-hour traffic, utterly impractical, but undeniably flashy. So, you're shuffling around in your magnificent, elongated poulaines, probably stubbing your toe on every uneven paving stone and silently cursing the fashion gods. But how exactly did this sartorial absurdity come about? The precise origins of the poulaine are, as with many historical trends, a little murky, but the consensus points towards a gradual evolution rather than a sudden, shoe-shattering revolution. Some historians believe the trend might have started as early as the 11th or 12th century, perhaps in various European courts, with toes slowly but surely getting longer. However, it's in the 14th century, particularly around the mid-1300s, that the poulaine truly hits its stride, or rather, its extended stumble. Think of it like this. One day, someone in a position of power, perhaps a particularly flamboyant duke or a trend-setting royal, decided their shoes needed just a little extra oomph. Maybe they added an inch, then two, and suddenly, everyone who was anyone felt the need to follow suit. It's the medieval equivalent of a celebrity wearing something outrageous on the red carpet, and suddenly fast fashion brands are churning out imitations by the thousands. Only, in this case, the imitation involved a lot more leather, a lot more cobbling, and a lot more tripping. The name, poulaine, itself offers a clue, even if historians debate its definitive accuracy. As we touched upon, it's thought to be derived from Polonia or Poland. Now, whether this means the Poles invented the style or simply championed it with such gusto that the name stuck, is one of those delightful historical quibbles. It's a bit like calling all sparkling wine champagne, even if it didn't come from that specific region. Perhaps a Polish noble arrived at a European court, sporting shoes of unprecedented length, and the fashion-conscious elites of France simply exclaimed, "Look at those Polonaise shoes!" And thus, a legend and a mouthful of shoe was born. Regardless of its geographical birthplace, the poulaine quickly became a symbol of extravagance and status across Western Europe. From England to Italy, from Germany to Spain, the fashionable elite embraced the elongated toe with an almost feverish devotion. Imagine the medieval equivalent of scrolling through Instagram, seeing all your favorite influencers sporting these ridiculous shoes, and feeling that irresistible urge to conform, even if it meant sacrificing comfort and mobility. Everyone's doing it. You'd probably whine to your exasperated spouse, trying to justify spending a small fortune on footwear that made walking feel like an extreme sport. The construction of these shoes was surprisingly complex, especially for the more extreme examples. To maintain that rigid, upward curling point, cobblers would often stuff the empty toe with materials like moss, hair, or even baleen, the flexible, whalebone-like material used for corsets and other stiffeners. Picture the poor whale, unknowingly contributing to the downfall of medieval ankles. This internal structuring was crucial because without it, the poulaine would simply flop about, turning a fashion statement into a sad, floppy appendage. Historians still argue whether the most extreme lengths were even practical for walking or if they were primarily for ceremonial occasions, where one mostly stood or was carried. It's likely a bit of both. A grand entrance in an impossibly long pair, followed by a quick change into something slightly less likely to send you face-planting. What fueled this obsession with elongation? Beyond simple status, there was a broader cultural context at play. The late Middle Ages was a period of increasing social mobility, with a growing merchant class accumulating wealth and aspiring to the aristocratic lifestyle. Fashion, then as now, was a powerful tool for self-definition and social signaling. If you couldn't trace your lineage back to a long line of dukes and counts, you could at least look like one by sporting the latest, most extravagant trends. The poulaine became a clear, undeniable visual marker of who was somebody and who was, well, just everyone else. It was an outward display of inner ambition, a sartorial shout from the rooftops saying, "I have arrived, and my shoes prove it." And of course, there was the sheer novelty and playful extravagance of it all. Imagine the conversations at court. "Have you seen Lord Bartholomew's new poulaines? They're practically a yard long." It was a topic of conversation, a visual spectacle, and a gentle source of amusement for those who could afford to partake in such frivolity. It's worth remembering that medieval life, while often harsh, wasn't entirely devoid of humor or a sense of the absurd. The poulaine, in its magnificent impracticality, probably offered a good chuckle to those not wearing them, and a perpetual grimace to those who were. Perhaps it was a way to make the mundane act of walking just a little bit more exciting, or at least a little more challenging. Now, let's talk about the lived experience of these fashion victims, trendsetters. You, the wearer of the mighty poulaine, faced a daily battle against your own footwear. Imagine attempting to navigate the uneven, often muddy, and frankly disgusting streets of a medieval town. Each step would be a carefully choreographed act of balance, a test of your spatial awareness. You'd have to lift your foot higher than usual to prevent the elongated toe from snagging on loose cobblestones, stray refuse, or perhaps a curious chicken. It was less walking, more a graceful or not so graceful, high-stepping dance. Think about the sheer amount of extra effort involved in just moving from point A to point B. Your calf muscles would likely be screaming in protest, your shins constantly bruised from unforeseen collisions. Forget about spontaneity. A sudden sprint to avoid a charging pig? Unthinkable. A quick pivot to greet a friend? A recipe for disaster. You were essentially encumbered by fashionable, yet profoundly impractical, extensions of your own feet. It's like trying to run a marathon while wearing skis on your hands, stylish, perhaps, but entirely unsuited for the task at hand. And stairs. Oh, the medieval stairs. Often steep, narrow, and winding, they posed an existential threat to the poulaine wearer. Each ascent would require careful placement of the foot, ensuring the long toe didn't get caught on the step above, sending you tumbling headfirst down to whatever unpleasantness awaited at the bottom. Descending would be an even greater challenge, forcing you to lean back dramatically, or perhaps descend backwards like a crab to avoid tripping. One can only imagine the exasperated sighs of medieval servants waiting for their masters to slowly, painfully descend a staircase, their poulaines click-clacking like a clumsy clock. Sitting down, a seemingly simple act, also became an exercise in strategic planning. Picture yourself at a medieval banquet, surrounded by lords and ladies, all sporting their impressive footwear. You couldn't just slide your feet under the table. No, that poulaine would collide with the table leg, sending you lurching forward, perhaps into a bowl of stew. Instead, you'd have to splay your legs awkwardly, or perhaps carefully tuck your poulaines beside your chair, making sure not to accidentally kick the person next to you. It was a constant negotiation with your environment, all for the sake of looking utterly fabulous. Beyond the physical challenges, there was the constant risk of damage to the shoes themselves. These weren't cheap, mass-produced items. Each pair was a significant investment, often custom-made. A torn toe, a broken reinforcement, or a scuffed tip would be a minor tragedy, requiring immediate repair from a skilled cobbler. Imagine the anguish of a nobleman seeing his perfectly pristine poulaines scuffed by an errant dog or a careless pedestrian. It was like driving a luxury car through a demolition derby. The potential for damage was ever present. Historians still argue whether the most extreme lengths of poulaines were even worn for everyday activities, or if they were reserved for grand, ceremonial occasions where the wearer would primarily be standing or perhaps carried. It's likely a mix. For court appearances or formal events, the longer, more elaborate poulaines would certainly make a statement. For a casual stroll through the market, perhaps a slightly more modest, though still pointed, version would be donned. But even the modest versions were still remarkably impractical by modern standards. There's also the question of hygiene. Medieval streets were not known for their pristine cleanliness. Your elongated poulaines would be constantly dragging through mud, animal droppings, and whatever else accumulated on the ground. The thought of cleaning those intricately shaped leather tips after a day out in the city is enough to make one sigh. It was a commitment not just to fashion, but to a rather intense cleaning regimen. Perhaps special poulaine cleaning servants were a thing? One can only hope. The very essence of the poulaine was its discomfort and impracticality. This wasn't a hidden inconvenience, it was the whole point. By enduring the physical challenges and investing in such an absurd item, you demonstrated your detachment from the necessity of manual labor and your elevated social standing. It was a silent, pointy boast, and perhaps, just perhaps, the slightest hint of discomfort added to the allure. After all, if it were easy, everyone would do it. And then, where would the fun be in that? As you hobble along in your increasingly painful poulaines, perhaps contemplating the societal pressures that led you to embrace such torture, let's delve a bit deeper into the intricate relationship between shoe length and social status in medieval Europe. This wasn't just a casual fashion choice. It was a highly regulated, unspoken, yet utterly obvious, system of non-verbal communication. The longer your poulaines, the higher your perch on the social ladder. It was a visual shorthand that everyone understood, from the lowliest peasant to the most powerful monarch. Imagine stepping into a crowded medieval hall, perhaps for a feast or a courtly gathering. Before a single word was exchanged, your feet had already spoken volumes about your position. If your poulaines barely extended beyond your toes, you were likely a commoner, perhaps a tradesman or a farmer, whose daily life demanded practical footwear. No grand pronouncements of wealth or leisure from you. But if your shoes stretched out significantly, perhaps a foot or more, then you were clearly a person of some means, a minor noble, a successful merchant, or a respected clergyman. And then there were the truly magnificent, the impossibly long, the toe-curling behemoths that only the highest aristocracy dared to wear. These were the footwear equivalents of a modern-day supercar, signaling immense wealth, inherited status, and a life completely free from the need to, say, run for a bus. Or, in this case, run for anything. These were the shoes of dukes, counts, and, of course, kings. It was a visual competition, a sartorial arms race where the length of your shoes was directly proportional to the size of your ego, or at least, your family's coffers. This phenomenon wasn't entirely unregulated, even before King Charles VI got involved. Sumptuary laws, those fascinating and often frustrating decrees designed to regulate consumption based on social class, often touched upon clothing, including footwear. While specific laws varied by region and time, the general intent was always the same: to maintain social order and prevent the lower classes from dressing above their station. Imagine being told you couldn't wear a certain type of fabric or a particular color because you weren't noble enough. It sounds absurd to us now, but it was a very real part of medieval life. The poulaine, in its exaggerated forms, became a prime target for such regulations because its length so clearly defied practical utility, making it a pure symbol of excess. The sheer impracticality of the longest poulaines served to underscore the wearer's elevated status. Only someone who didn't need to walk long distances, or engage in physical labor, or even simply get around quickly, could afford to wear such an impediment. If you were a knight, you couldn't possibly wear these into battle. Imagine trying to wield a sword with an extra 2 feet of shoe flopping around. So, they were specifically for showing off, for courtly life, for being seen. It was a subtle, yet powerful declaration. My life is so easy, I can afford to make walking difficult. There are even accounts that suggested the length of the poulaine dictated where you could sit at court or in a church. A man with particularly long shoes might need more space, and thus, by extension, was granted a more prominent position. It was a physical manifestation of social hierarchy, played out in leather and whalebone. This was also an era before widespread literacy, so visual cues were incredibly important for conveying information. Clothes weren't just about covering yourself, they were a complex language. A specific hat, a certain color, the richness of a fabric, and yes, the length of your shoes, all communicated a wealth of information about who you were, what you did, and where you stood in the grand tapestry of medieval society. Historians still argue about the exact metrics of how length corresponded to rank across different regions, but the general principle was universally understood. Think about it this way. Today, someone might buy a ridiculously expensive watch or a high-end designer handbag. These items, while functional, often derive a significant portion of their value from their brand and exclusivity. In a way, the medieval poulaine was the ultimate luxury brand item. It was impractical, expensive, and instantly recognizable as a mark of the elite. It wasn't about telling time or carrying essentials. It was about telling the world who you were, even if it meant risking a perpetual toe stubbing. The constant battle with the pavement was just part of the price of looking fabulous. While you're still trying to figure out how to gracefully navigate a doorway with your elaborate, foot-extending contraptions, let's pivot slightly and consider another powerful force that took issue with the pointy shoe phenomenon: the church. Because, as you might recall from our earlier chats about medieval life, if there was something new, flashy, or even slightly uncomfortable in fashion, the church usually had an opinion, and it rarely involved a ringing endorsement. The clergy of the late Middle Ages viewed the poulaine with a mixture of disdain, moral outrage, and probably a little bit of good old-fashioned bewilderment. Their complaints weren't just about the impracticality, though you can bet they tooted about that. No, their objections ran deeper, rooted in concerns about vanity, pride, and the very fabric of Christian morality. To them, these ridiculously long shoes were a blatant symbol of extravagance and excessive display, a sign of worldly indulgence that distracted from spiritual devotion. Imagine a stern-faced bishop delivering a fiery sermon from the pulpit. He's probably gesticulating wildly, perhaps even accidentally whacking himself in the face with his sleeve. He would denounce the poulaines as shoes of the devil, or claws of Satan, or some equally dramatic moniker designed to strike fear into the hearts of the fashion-conscious. He might lament how men, and even some women, were more concerned with the length of their footwear than with the state of their souls. Why, he would thunder, do you spend your precious coin on these absurd extensions of your feet, when that money could feed the poor, or build a chapel, or perhaps even buy a sensible pair of sandals? The church saw fashion trends like the poulaine as a dangerous expression of superbia, or pride, one of the 7 deadly sins. The longer the shoe, the more prideful the wearer, in their estimation. It was an outward manifestation of an inward spiritual corruption. They believed that such ostentatious displays of wealth and status, especially through something as seemingly trivial as footwear, led people astray from humility and piety. It's a bit like today's debates over conspicuous consumption, but with more sermons and less Twitter. Beyond pride, there was also a pervasive concern about vanity and effeminacy. The church, with its strict views on gender roles, often associated elaborate clothing and excessive ornamentation with women, and thus, men adopting such styles were seen as blurring the lines, becoming less manly. While poulaines were primarily a male fashion, Their very impracticality and emphasis on display could be construed as soft or frivolous by the more rigid minds of the clergy. They probably preferred their men in sturdy, unadorned boots, ready for honest labor or, crusade. Some clerical texts and sermons even linked the poulaines to debauchery and licentiousness. The argument went that such frivolous attire was worn by those who indulged in earthly pleasures rather than focusing on the divine. Perhaps they imagined young nobles, bedecked in their finery, including absurdly long shoes, skipping off to clandestine assignations rather than attending vespers. Historians still argue whether these moral condemnations had a significant impact on public behavior or if they were largely ignored by the fashion-forward elite, but they certainly added to the cultural conversation around these peculiar shoes. The Church's opposition wasn't just verbal. They often supported, or even directly lobbied for, the implementation of sumptuary laws that aimed to curb such perceived excesses. These laws, as we touched on, were designed to regulate clothing based on social class, but they also had a moral dimension, aiming to enforce modesty and prevent perceived extravagance. For the Church, the poulaine was a prime example of a fashion that desperately needed to be reined in. So, while you might have felt like a king walking around in your long, pointy shoes, the Church would have seen you as a misguided soul, dangerously close to falling into a pit of vanity and sin. They were less concerned with your comfort and more concerned with the comfort of your eternal soul, which, they believed, was being thoroughly corrupted by every extra inch of leather on your feet. It put a bit of a dampener on a fashionable day out, wouldn't you say? Imagine trying to enjoy a pleasant stroll through the market, only to be constantly reminded by passing priests that your footwear was a direct ticket to perdition. Talk about a fashion faux pas with eternal consequences. All right, you've strutted your stuff, tripped a few times, and probably endured a stern lecture from a passing friar about the eternal damnation awaiting those with excessively pointy shoes. But the poulaine trend, despite clerical disapproval and obvious impracticality, showed no signs of truly slowing down. That is, until a certain monarch decided enough was enough. Enter King Charles VI of France, also known, rather tragically, as Charles the Beloved and later, Charles the Mad. But for our story tonight, let's just focus on his moment of royal fashion intervention. It was the late 14th century, specifically around 1368, though some sources might quibble about the exact year. Historians still argue the precise timing of royal decrees. Charles VI was a young king at this point, having ascended to the throne in 1380. The poulaine craze was at its peak, with the nobility pushing the boundaries of shoe length to increasingly absurd extremes. Imagine Charles, sitting on his throne, perhaps with his own moderately pointy shoes, looking out at his court. Every minister, every duke, every aspiring courtier seemed to be engaged in a silent competition to have the most ridiculous footwear. Now, why would a king, with all the weighty matters of state, wars to fight, taxes to collect, rebellions to quell, and probably endless banquets to endure, bother himself with shoes? It seems like a rather trivial concern, doesn't it? Well, not in medieval Europe. As we've discussed, clothing was a powerful symbol of social order. When the boundaries of fashion became too blurred, when commoners started mimicking the styles of nobles, even if they couldn't afford the finest materials, they could certainly aspire to the shape. It was seen as a threat to the established hierarchy. The king, as the ultimate authority, was responsible for maintaining order, and that included social order. The Church's constant moralizing against excessive display certainly played a role, aligning with the secular power's desire to keep everyone in their proper place. The poulaines, by virtue of their extreme and flamboyant nature, were seen as a symptom of a society perhaps getting a little too carried away with itself. It was a visual anarchy of the feet, and the king felt it was his duty to restore some semblance of sartorial sanity. So, King Charles VI, in his infinite wisdom, or perhaps just his immense frustration at tripping over someone's shoe, issued a royal decree specifically targeting the length of poulaines. The exact wording of the decree has been debated, but its intent was clear: to limit the length of shoe points based on the wearer's social status. This wasn't a blanket ban on pointy shoes entirely, but rather a legislative attempt to rein in the most extreme examples and to re-establish the visual hierarchy that the fashion had, ironically, both created and then spectacularly undermined. Picture the scene. A royal herald, perhaps struggling slightly with his own less than practical footwear, unrolls a parchment in the town square. He clears his throat, and in a booming voice reads out the king's command. Imagine the murmurs, the gasps, the indignant huffs from the fashion-forward elite. What? My shoes are a matter of state. Probably went something like that. This decree wasn't unique to France either. Similar sumptuary laws concerning poulaines cropped up in England, where they were also called cracos, and other parts of Europe. It was a continent-wide fashion crisis that required a continent-wide royal response. The English king, Edward III, had already made attempts to regulate excessive dress, and the French decree was part of this broader European trend of monarchs attempting to control what their subjects wore, often for reasons of social order, morality, or even economic protection, encouraging local textile industries, for example. For Charles VI, it was less about economics and more about asserting control. The poulaine had become a symbol of excess, a challenge to traditional norms, and frankly, an enormous tripping hazard. The king likely saw it as an amusing, yet ultimately destabilizing, influence. The decree was a way of saying, "All right, you can have your fun, but there are limits. And I, your king, will set those limits." It was a fashion police order straight from the top. So, King Charles VI, perhaps tired of tripping over elongated footwear at court functions, has laid down the royal gauntlet. The poulaine, in its most extreme forms, is officially curtailed. But issuing a decree is one thing. Actually enforcing it in a bustling, often chaotic, medieval society is quite another. This wasn't like today, where a fashion police officer might write you a ticket for wearing white after Labor Day. Oh no, the medieval approach to enforcement had a certain flair. And by flair, I mean fines and public humiliation. Because nothing says, "Don't wear those shoes," like being shamed in front of your peers. The decree likely stipulated specific maximum lengths for poulaines, varying by social rank. For instance, a knight might be allowed a shoe length of 6 inches beyond the foot, while a mere commoner might be limited to 2 inches, if any extension at all. The highest nobility, perhaps even the king himself, might still be permitted slightly longer lengths, thus preserving some semblance of the status hierarchy. It wasn't about eradicating the pointy shoe, but about putting a very literal cap on its ambitions. Now, how did they enforce this? It wasn't as if there were dedicated fashion inspectors lurking in every alleyway, tape measures at the ready. Enforcement was often sporadic, relying on local officials, town criers, and perhaps even nosy neighbors. Imagine a town guard, probably bored out of his mind, suddenly spotting a suspiciously long poulaine sticking out from under a nobleman's cloak. He might then approach, pull out a measuring stick, perhaps one specifically calibrated for shoe lengths, and deliver the bad news. The primary method of punishment for violating sumptuary laws, including those on shoes, was a fine. This was often a significant sum, designed to hit the offender where it hurt most, their wallet. For a wealthy noble, a fine might be an annoyance, but for someone of lesser means trying to ape the aristocracy, it could be a crippling blow. Imagine saving up for months to afford a pair of slightly too long poulaines, only to have them confiscated and incur a hefty fine. It was enough to make you stick to sensible boots forever. But beyond the monetary penalty, there was the far more potent weapon of public humiliation. Medieval society was deeply concerned with honor and reputation. Being publicly shamed was often worse than a physical punishment. One of the common methods of enforcing sumptuary laws was the confiscation and public destruction of the offending garments. Picture this: you've been caught flaunting an illegally long poulaine. The town crier announces your transgression, perhaps listing your name and the egregious length of your footwear. Then, for all to see, your precious, painstakingly crafted, ridiculously expensive shoes are paraded through the town square, before being unceremoniously cut, torn, or even burned. Imagine the collective gasp, the whispered gossip, the sheer embarrassment. It was designed to send a clear message. Don't mess with the king's fashion laws, or your shoes will suffer the consequences. It's the medieval equivalent of having your designer knockoffs publicly shredded on TikTok, but without the benefit of anonymity. There are even accounts, though perhaps exaggerated by chroniclers with a good sense of humor, of particularly stubborn offenders being forced to wear their truncated shoes, or even have their feet bound so they couldn't extend into the forbidden length. While possibly apocryphal for routine enforcement, such stories highlight the grim determination of authorities to make an example of those who defied the royal will. Historians still argue about the true effectiveness of these sumptuary laws. Were they universally enforced? Probably not. Did they completely eradicate the poulaine? Also no. But they certainly put a damper on the most extreme excesses and reminded everyone of their place in the social hierarchy. It was a constant game of cat and mouse between fashion-conscious individuals pushing boundaries and authorities trying to pull them back. For every person caught and shamed, there were likely many more who managed to slip by, their extra-long toes tucked subtly under their cloaks. But the fear of that public humiliation, that dreadful moment when your beloved shoes met their ignominious end, surely made many think twice before investing in an illegally long pair. So, you've just seen your magnificent, perhaps slightly too long, poulaines meet an ignominious end at the hands of a stern royal official, or perhaps you're simply terrified that they might. What happens next in a society where a fashionable item has been officially curtailed? Well, as with any prohibition, where there's demand, there's always supply, and so began the delightful era of the black market for pointy shoes. Because if you couldn't flaunt your status openly, you'd simply have to do it on the sly, wouldn't you? The royal decree, despite its grand intentions and the public shaming rituals, couldn't instantly extinguish a fashion trend that had been building for decades. Human nature, particularly when it comes to expressing oneself through appearance, is remarkably stubborn. The desire to stand out, to show off one's wealth, or simply to adhere to what was considered fashionable, didn't disappear overnight. Instead, it went underground, much like secret societies for people who really loved impractical footwear. Imagine hushed whispers in dimly lit taverns, or clandestine meetings in back alleys. "Psst, buddy, heard you're looking for something extra long?" The cobblers, who had made a tidy living crafting these elaborate shoes, weren't about to give up their lucrative trade. Many would have continued their work, but now with an added layer of secrecy and, no doubt, an inflated price tag for their illicit services. The risk was higher, so the reward had to be too. It was a new kind of luxury market, operating just beneath the radar of royal authority. These black market poulaines might not have been openly displayed in shop windows. Instead, they would be made to order, or perhaps brought out for viewing in discreet locations. Imagine slipping into a back room, surrounded by the smell of leather and a palpable sense of illicit excitement, to gaze upon a pair of truly magnificent and undeniably illegal shoes. It was like buying contraband spices but for your feet. The clientele for these forbidden fashion statements would, of course, be those who could afford the heightened risk and the steeper price. Wealthy nobles, ambitious merchants, anyone who felt that their status demanded a longer poulaine, regardless of royal decree. For some, the fact that the shoes were forbidden might have even added to their allure. There's a certain thrill, isn't there, in defying authority, in subtly sticking it to the man, or in this case, the king, all while looking incredibly stylish? It was an act of quiet rebellion, expressed one pointed step at a time. Historians still argue about the true scale and longevity of this black market. Was it a widespread phenomenon, or more of an occasional indulgence for the truly daring? It's likely that the most extreme poulaines became rarer and harder to obtain, but more modest, over-the-limit styles probably continued to be crafted and worn with a wink and a nod. You might see someone sporting a pair that was just a little too long, daring the authorities to call them out. It was a delicate dance between pushing the boundaries and avoiding public humiliation. One quirky tidbit about this era: some accounts suggest that men, when riding horses, would sometimes tie the tips of their exceptionally long poulaines to their knees to prevent them from dragging on the ground or getting caught in the stirrup. Now imagine doing that with an illegal pair of shoes, trying to quickly untie them if a royal guard approached. It adds another layer of comical absurdity to an already ridiculous situation. The existence of a black market highlights a fascinating aspect of medieval control. While authority could legislate against certain behaviors or possessions, it couldn't always change human desire. Fashion, as we know, is a powerful force, driven by trends, status, and individual expression. When official channels restrict that expression, unofficial ones often emerge to fill the void. So, while King Charles VI might have dreamed of a kingdom of sensible, short-toed footwear, the reality was probably a good deal more pointy, under the table, of course. You've just witnessed the murky depths of the black market, where daring fashionistas sought their forbidden footwear fix. But not everyone was content to simply operate in the shadows. For some, the royal decree wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a challenge, an affront to their personal style, and a direct invitation for resistance. This is where our medieval fashion rebels emerge, subtly, or not so subtly, defying the king's efforts to regulate their very souls. These weren't necessarily loud, boisterous rebellions with banners and pitchforks, at least not directly related to shoes. Instead, the defiance was often more nuanced, a quiet but persistent pushback against the sumptuary laws. Think of it as a fashion-based civil disobedience, where the weapon of choice was an extra inch of leather. Who were these rebels? They were the young, the wealthy, the trend-obsessed, and anyone who felt that their individual expression was being unduly stifled by royal decree. For a noble, particularly one with independent wealth and a strong sense of his own importance, adhering to arbitrary shoe-length limits might have felt demeaning. "The king can tell me how to run my lands," they might have scoffed, "but he can't tell me how long my shoes should be." One common form of resistance was simply to ignore the law as much as possible, or to interpret it in the most generous way. If the law said, no more than X inches, some might push it to X plus a millimeter, daring anyone to measure. It was a game of inches, quite literally. They might wear their longer poulaines in less public settings, or when visiting a friendly court outside of France where the decree held no sway. It was a subtle act of defiance, a quiet middle finger, or rather, a quiet toe, to the authorities. Another form of rebellion was through clever circumvention. Perhaps cobblers and wearers developed new techniques to make the poulaine appear shorter than it was, or employed materials that were harder to classify under the strictures of the law. This is where innovation, born of necessity and a love for long shoes, truly shone. Historians still argue whether some of the more elaborate poulaine structures, particularly those with detachable tips, were a direct response to these laws, allowing wearers to quickly shorten their shoes if a royal official approached. Imagine a medieval quick-change artist, whipping off a poulaine tip just as the fashion police rounded the corner. It sounds like something out of a medieval spy novel, doesn't it? There's also the element of social pressure and peer approval. In a society where looking fashionable and demonstrating status was paramount, defying the law might have even enhanced one's reputation among certain circles. If all your friends were still rocking those impossibly long shoes, would you really want to be the one showing up in a sensible, short-toed pair? Probably not. The desire to fit in with your chosen social group often outweighs the fear of official reprimand, especially for the young and daring. Consider the anecdotes of those who were caught. While some faced public humiliation, others might have found ways to mitigate the consequences. Perhaps a bribe to a lenient guard, or a powerful patron who could intercede on their behalf. The effectiveness of the law, like most laws, relied heavily on the willingness and consistency of its enforcement. And in an era before widespread bureaucracy, consistent enforcement was often a pipe dream. So, while the king issued his decree, and the church thundered its condemnations, the spirit of the poulain lived on, perhaps a little less overtly, but certainly not extinguished. The fashion rebels, with their daring footwear choices, served as a testament to the enduring human desire for self-expression, even when faced with royal disapproval. They remind us that even in matters as seemingly trivial as shoes, people will always find ways to push boundaries and assert their individuality, one long, defiant step at a time. It's a reminder that fashion, at its heart, is often about more than just clothes. It's about identity and freedom. As you consider the quiet acts of rebellion against the king's shoe decree, let's delve into a curious paradox that underpins the entire poulain phenomenon: the ongoing debate between practicality and prestige. Why, in an era often characterized by hardship and necessity, did people so vehemently cling to a fashion that actively hindered their movement and comfort? The answer, as is often the case in human history, lies in the complex interplay of status, signaling, and the irresistible allure of the impractical. Imagine the common sense prevailing in your modern mind. Why would anyone wear shoes that make it difficult to walk, to sit, to simply exist? You'd opt for comfort, for efficiency, for something that allows you to navigate your day with ease. But in medieval society, particularly among the elite, comfort was not always the primary consideration. Indeed, discomfort could be a badge of honor. The poulain, in its exaggerated form, was a tangible, undeniable symbol of leisure and wealth. If you wore a shoe so long and unwieldy that you couldn't possibly engage in manual labor, it sent a clear message: I don't have to work. I have servants to carry me, or horses to ride, or simply enough time to amble about at a snail's pace. The very impracticality of the poulain was its greatest asset as a status symbol. It wasn't about function, it was about demonstration. It was the medieval equivalent of owning a mansion with 30 rooms that you never use, a pure display of excess. Contrast this with the footwear of a peasant or a craftsman. Their shoes would be sturdy, practical, built for durability and comfort during long hours of toil. They wouldn't have the luxury of extended toes that could snag on a plow or get stuck in a loom. Their shoes were about survival and utility. The poulain, therefore, created a dramatic visual distinction between those who worked with their hands and those who did not. This brings us to the concept of conspicuous consumption, a term often associated with later periods but perfectly applicable here. It's the idea that people buy and display expensive and unnecessary items to show off their wealth and status. The poulain was a prime example of this. It wasn't a necessity, it was a luxury. Its value wasn't in its utility, but in its ability to signal social standing. You bought a poulain not because it helped you walk better, but because it helped you look better, at least in the eyes of your peers. Historians still argue whether this fashion trend was a conscious, strategic choice by the elite to visually separate themselves from the rising merchant class, or simply an organic trend that escalated due to peer pressure and the desire for novelty. It was likely a bit of both. Fashion often starts organically, but then becomes codified as a marker of social identity. When the merchant class began to adopt similar styles, pushing the boundaries themselves, it created a kind of fashion arms race, where the nobility had to constantly find new ways to distinguish themselves, often through ever-increasing extravagance. There's also a psychological element at play. For the wearer, enduring the discomfort of the poulain might have reinforced their own self-perception of importance. I am so grand, they might have subconsciously thought, that I can afford to walk around in these ridiculous things. It was a form of self-affirmation, a daily reminder of their elevated place in the social hierarchy. It's a bit like someone wearing an ill-fitting, but incredibly expensive suit today. It might not be comfortable, but it conveys a certain image. And let's not forget the simple allure of novelty and trendiness. Even if they knew it was impractical, the desire to be in fashion can be incredibly powerful. Imagine all your friends wearing the latest, most outlandish shoes. Would you want to be left out, looking hopelessly old-fashioned in your sensible boots? Unlikely. Peer pressure, then as now, was a potent force driving fashion choices, even those that defied all logic. So, while your feet might have ached and your shins might have been perpetually bruised, the poulaine offered something far more valuable in medieval society than mere comfort. It offered prestige, a clear signal of your place in the world, and a visual testament to your effortless superiority. The pain, one might argue, was simply part of the price of looking fabulous. As you continue your imaginary, slightly awkward stroll through medieval Europe, perpetually dodging potential poulaine-related mishaps, let's widen our gaze beyond the confines of France. Because while King Charles VI was trying to rein in the long-toed madness, the fashion for poulaines or similar elongated footwear was making its mark across the continent. It truly became a pan-European phenomenon, illustrating how interconnected medieval societies were, at least when it came to shared sartorial sensibilities. You might hear these shoes referred to by different names depending on the region. In England, for instance, they were often called Krakos, a name also believed to derive from Krakow, Poland, reinforcing the idea of a Polish origin or strong Polish adoption of the style. So, whether you were in Paris or London, Florence or Nuremberg, if you were part of the fashionable elite, your feet were likely sporting some form of elongated elegance. It was a unifying fashion statement, despite the linguistic and political differences between nations. Imagine the bustling trade routes of the late Middle Ages, the winding rivers, the dusty roads, the sea lanes plied by merchant ships. Along with silks, spices, and precious metals, ideas and fashions traveled too. A nobleman visiting the French court from England would see the latest poulaines, and upon returning home, would naturally desire to emulate the style. Or perhaps Italian merchants, famed for their banking and trade networks, would bring back sketches or even actual examples of the latest footwear trends from their northern counterparts. This cross-pollination of fashion was a vibrant part of medieval cultural exchange. The adoption of the poulaine wasn't uniform, of course. While the general trend of elongation spread, regional variations certainly existed. Some areas might have favored more moderate lengths, while others embraced the extremes with gusto. The materials used could also vary based on local availability and craftsmanship. For instance, luxurious velvet poulaines might be more common in Italy, while English versions might lean towards more robust leathers. Historians still argue about the precise regional nuances of poulaine styles and how much they truly differed beyond mere nomenclature. It's a delightful rabbit hole of scholarly debate, if you're into that sort of thing. Even the specific objections to poulaines weren't unique to France. As we mentioned, England also saw attempts to curb the excessive length of shoes through sumptuary laws. King Edward III, for example, long before Charles VI's decree, made efforts to regulate extravagant dress, reflecting a similar concern about maintaining social order through sartorial control. The Church, too, voiced its moral disapproval across all Catholic lands, seeing the poulaine as a universal symbol of vanity and pride. So, no matter where you were, if you were rocking a pair of ridiculously long shoes, you could expect a certain amount of side-eye from the clergy. The fact that a fashion trend, as seemingly frivolous as a shoe length, could become such a widespread phenomenon across a fragmented continent speaks volumes about the power of shared cultural values and aspirations. Despite wars and rivalries, European aristocracies often looked to each other for social cues and cultural trends. They were, in many ways, a transnational elite, connected by lineage, marriage, and, it seems, a collective desire for impractical footwear. One quirky tidbit. Some sources suggest that the fashion for poulaines might have actually contributed to a decline in certain types of medieval dance, as the shoes made agile footwork incredibly difficult. Imagine trying to perform a sprightly saltarello or a vigorous estampe while constantly battling against your own extended toes. It adds a layer of comical restriction to an otherwise lively social activity. Perhaps this was a secret blessing in disguise for those with two left feet. So, while Charles VI was battling the fashion tide in France, similar struggles were unfolding elsewhere. The poulaine, in all its elongated glory, was a testament to a shared European aristocratic culture, a bizarre fashion unifying nations through shared impracticality. It reminds us that trends, even the most absurd ones, often transcend borders, leaving their strangely pointed mark on the historical landscape. You've seen the poulaine conquer Europe, defy kings, and confound clergymen. But like all trends, even the most stubbornly persistent, its reign eventually came to an end. So, let's trace the decline of the pointy shoe, the slow, gradual shrinking of the toes, until they eventually settled into more sensible, rounded forms. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic collapse, but more of a gentle, drawn-out fade, like a really long, sleepy sigh. The peak of poulaine extravagance was firmly in the late 14th century. King Charles VI's decree in France, and similar sumptuary laws elsewhere, certainly played a part in taming the wilder excesses. While they didn't eradicate the style overnight, they undoubtedly made it riskier and less socially acceptable to wear the truly absurd length. Imagine the subtle shift. Instead of striving for 2 feet of toe, people might aim for just 1, then perhaps 6 inches, a gradual retreat from the extreme. However, it wasn't just royal decrees that led to the poulaine's demise. Fashion, as we know, is a fickle beast, constantly evolving and reacting to broader societal changes. By the early to mid-15th century, new aesthetic sensibilities began to emerge. The focus shifted away from extreme verticality and elongation in clothing. Instead, the trend moved towards broader, more rounded silhouette. Think of the wider shoulders and padded chests that would become popular in men's fashion later in the 15th century. This shift in overall sartorial preference naturally influenced footwear. As the ideal male silhouette broadened, the narrow, elongated poulaine simply didn't fit the new aesthetic. It would have looked odd, perhaps even comically outdated, against the backdrop of new fashion trends. It's like trying to wear skinny jeans with a Victorian-era bustle. It just doesn't quite work, does it? The fashion for a broader, squarer toe began to take hold, a style known as the duckbill or bear paw shoe. These were the complete opposite of the poulaine, featuring wide, often squared-off toes, sometimes comically broad themselves, but at least, blessedly, short. This new fashion was driven by various factors. The rise of a new generation of elites who wanted to distinguish themselves from the previous one, the influence of new artistic movements, and perhaps, a collective sigh of relief from medieval feet. Imagine the sheer comfort of slipping into a wide-toed shoe after years of cramming your digits into a narrow, elongated prison. It must have felt like a holiday for your toes. Historians still argue whether the decline was more due to the force of law or the natural evolution of fashion trends, but it was likely a combination of both. One quirky tidbit. During the transition away from poulaines, some shoe styles actually incorporated small, decorative slashes or openings on the toe. While these weren't nearly as long, they were a subtle nod to the previous era's fascination with the extreme toe, like a tiny, nostalgic wink to the poulaine. It was a way of referencing the past without fully embracing its impracticality. By the end of the 15th century and into the early 16th, the poulaine was well and truly out of fashion. It had become a historical curiosity, a relic of a bygone era of fashion extremism. While remnants of pointed toes would appear in different forms throughout history, the exaggerated, often absurdly long poulaine of the 14th century was largely confined to history books and the occasional comedic illustration. You might see it in period paintings, a strange testament to a moment when comfort took a back seat to ostentatious display. The lesson here is that fashion, no matter how entrenched or how fiercely defended, is always subject to change. What is in one decade can be utterly out the next, and sometimes it takes a king, a church, and a collective desire for something new to finally put an end to even the most persistent of trends. So, you can finally relax those cramped toes of yours. The era of extreme pointy shoes has gracefully, or perhaps awkwardly, shuffled into the annals of history. As you take a deep, relaxed breath, finally free from the imagined tyranny of elongated footwear, let's take a moment to reflect on a broader, rather comforting truth about human society: fashion's enduring cycles. The story of the Poulaine, with its rise, royal decree, subtle rebellion, and eventual decline, isn't just a quirky historical anecdote. It's a perfect microcosm of how trends operate, how they appear, escalate, face opposition, and eventually fade, only to be reinterpreted much later. Think about it. Have you ever seen a fashion trend today that you thought was utterly ridiculous, only to watch it become incredibly popular? Perhaps oversized clothing or tiny sunglasses that barely cover your eyes, or even certain styles of ugly sneakers. The reaction to these trends, initial bemusement, followed by widespread adoption, then sometimes a backlash, echoes the journey of the Poulaine almost perfectly. It seems that human beings are hardwired to oscillate between practical comfort and flamboyant display. One moment, fashion emphasizes practicality and modesty; the next, it swings wildly towards extravagance and showmanship. The Poulaine itself replaced earlier, simpler shoe styles and was eventually replaced by the broad-toed, duckbill shoe. But even the duckbill, while practical in terms of toe room, often became exaggerated in its width, proving that the desire for unique and attention-grabbing footwear didn't disappear, it just changed shape. Historians still argue whether these shifts are purely aesthetic, or if they reflect deeper societal anxieties or economic changes. Perhaps after a period of austerity, people crave more opulent displays, and vice versa. It's a fascinating, never-ending dance. Consider the human desire for status signaling. While the Poulaine was a medieval embodiment of this, we still do it today, albeit with different garments. A designer handbag, a luxury car, even a specific brand of smartphone, these are all modern Poulaines, signaling wealth, taste, or perceived taste, and membership in a particular social group. We use our possessions to communicate who we are, or who we aspire to be. The underlying impulse is centuries old, simply manifested in new forms. And what about the resistance to authority? Just as medieval nobles found ways to circumvent sumptuary laws, modern fashion lovers often find ways around dress codes or societal norms. The act of customizing clothing, embracing subcultures, or intentionally wearing something that defies the mainstream is a direct descendant of that quiet rebellion against King Charles VI's decree. It's a universal human trait to push boundaries and assert individuality, especially through something as personal as what you choose to wear. Even the Church's moral objections find echoes in modern discourse about fashion. While less about eternal damnation, discussions around fast fashion and its ethical implications, or debates about modesty in dress, show that society still grapples with the moral and ethical dimensions of clothing. It seems we just can't help but infuse our garments with meaning beyond their mere function. One mainstream historical fact that illustrates this cycle is the periodic resurgence of pointed shoes themselves. While not to the extreme lengths of the Poulaine, styles with significantly pointed toes have come in and out of fashion numerous times since the medieval era, notably in the 1950s with stiletto heels and men's dress shoes, and even in certain contemporary styles. The form changes, the materials update, but the underlying appeal of the elongated silhouette occasionally reasserts itself. A quirky tidbit to mull over: the very concept of uncomfortable fashion as a status symbol persists. Think of corsets, towering heels, or even restrictive formal wear. Sometimes, the less comfortable an item is, the more it signifies that the wearer doesn't have to be comfortable, a sign of leisure or importance. It's a testament to the idea that humans will endure a lot for the sake of looking right. So, as you drift deeper into relaxation, recognize that the story of the Poulaine is not just about old shoes. It's about us. It's about the timeless dance between comfort and display, rebellion and conformity, practicality and pure, unadulterated fashion folly. And rest assured, as long as humans are around, these cycles will continue, perhaps not with 2-foot-long shoes, but with something equally fascinating and, no doubt, equally impractical. Now that we've seen how fashion cycles eternally, let's zoom in on what the peculiar reign of the Poulaine, with its pointy excesses and royal interventions, truly tells us about footwear as social commentary. Beyond mere aesthetics, these shoes, and the debates surrounding them, offer a surprisingly rich window into the values, anxieties, and power structures of medieval society. Firstly, the Poulaine speaks volumes about the rigid class structure of the Middle Ages. As we've gently explored, the length of your shoe was a direct, undeniable visual cue to your place in the social hierarchy. It was a sartorial shinfunjum, an identity card worn on your feet. There was no mistaking a duke for a ditch digger if you just looked at their toes. This wasn't just about showing off wealth. It was about reinforcing a divinely ordained social order, where everyone knew their place, and clothing helped to illustrate that. Secondly, the Church's vehement opposition highlights the ongoing medieval tension between worldly pleasure and spiritual devotion. The clergy saw the Poulaine as a symbol of superbia, pride, and vanity, a distraction from the righteous path. This wasn't just about shoes, it was about the very soul of society. Were people focusing too much on fleeting earthly fashions, and not enough on their eternal salvation? The Poulaine became an unlikely battleground in this broader moral struggle. Historians still argue whether the Church's condemnations were primarily driven by genuine moral concern or by a desire to exert control over public life and curb the perceived excesses of the nobility. Perhaps it was a comfortable blend of both. Thirdly, the royal decree itself, issued by King Charles VI, underscores the medieval monarch's role as not just a military leader or a dispenser of justice, but also as a guardian of social order and morality. A king intervening in fashion might seem absurd to us today, but in an era where outward appearance was so intrinsically linked to status and societal cohesion, controlling what people wore was seen as a legitimate, even necessary, act of governance. It was about preventing fashion anarchy from spilling over into actual social unrest. It's a quaint reminder that even seemingly trivial matters can become deeply political when they touch upon the delicate balance of power. The very impracticality of the Poulaine offers fascinating commentary too. It highlights a society where, for the elite, leisure and display trumped functionality. In a world that was often harsh and demanding, the ability to wear something utterly useless for practical purposes was the ultimate flex. It screamed, "I don't need to be efficient. I have people for that." It's a curious human tendency, isn't it? To take something functional, like a shoe, and twist it into an extreme, almost unusable form, simply for the sake of showing off. One mainstream historical fact to consider. The concept of sumptuary laws, of which the Poulaine decree was a prime example, existed across many cultures and eras, from ancient Rome to Renaissance Italy and even beyond. This indicates a universal human desire by authorities to control outward appearance as a means of controlling society, a fascinating recurring pattern. A quirky tidbit. Some medieval medical treatises actually suggested that wearing poulaines could lead to various foot ailments, including bunions and hammer toes, due to the unnatural confinement and elongation of the feet. So, not only were they a social statement, but they might have been an early form of self-inflicted orthopedic torture. Imagine the medieval equivalent of a podiatrist shaking their head in despair. Ultimately, the Poulaine, in its quiet, pointy way, tells us a story about power, status, morality, and the enduring human desire for self-expression. It's a testament to how even the most mundane objects, like a pair of shoes, can become deeply embedded with meaning, reflecting the complex tapestry of the society that creates and wears them. So, as you finally feel your imaginary toes relax into something sensible, appreciate the profound historical journey they just took you on. As we gently bring our journey to a close, your imaginary feet, now blessedly freed from the confines of those absurdly long poulaines, can finally stretch out in comfort. Let's wrap up our thoughts on these peculiar historical footwear choices, thinking about the broader, timeless allure of fashion's follies. It's a comforting thought, isn't it, that throughout history, humans have found endlessly inventive, often utterly impractical, ways to adorn themselves? The story of the Poulaine is a whisper from the past, reminding us that our modern obsessions with trends, status symbols, and the ever-shifting sands of what's in are nothing new. We might shake our heads at the medieval noble risking a broken ankle for the sake of a long toe, but are our own fashion choices always perfectly logical? How many times have we bought something simply because it was fashionable, perhaps enduring a little discomfort or a considerable dent in our wallet, just to feel like we're part of the moment? It seems the human desire to express oneself through clothing and often to elevate one's status through outward display is a constant across the centuries. Think of the sheer effort involved in maintaining these trends. The skilled cobblers, the materials sourced, the constant repairs, and the social dances around rules and regulations. It wasn't just about putting on a pair of shoes. It was an entire ecosystem of production, consumption, and societal negotiation. It reminds us that fashion is a powerful cultural force, capable of sparking royal decrees and clerical condemnations, all over a few inches of leather. The gentle humor in our story comes from the sheer absurdity of it all. A king worried about shoes. A church thundering about sin from footwear. People risking fines and public humiliation just to have longer toes. It's a delightful reminder that history, while often serious, is also full of moments of charming, human folly. These are the details that bring the past to life, making it relatable even in its strangeness. And so, as the day fades and the world outside begins to quiet, let the imagery of those peculiar pointy shoes slowly dissolve. Picture them not as objects of ridicule, but as silent witnesses to a bygone era's values, a testament to human creativity, vanity, and the enduring quest for identity. They remind us that beneath the grand narratives of kings and battles, history is also woven from the everyday details, the small choices that collectively paint a vibrant picture of how people lived, what they valued, and even what made them chuckle. Now, as you settle deeper into your pillow, feel your breath slow, a gentle, rhythmic flow like the calm tide. Let the echoes of distant medieval street sounds soften, fading into the peaceful hum of your own space. Imagine the quiet workshop of a medieval cobbler, his tools laid aside, the scent of leather lingering, as the moon casts long shadows across his bench. The stories of history, like the soft light of a distant star, are always there, waiting to lull you into a peaceful slumber. Allow your mind to drift, light and unburdened, as the quiet of